Hi there. Happy to be with you here from the home office in Clintonville, Wisconsin. Talking about the last two chapters of JPonMacCulloch, chapter 24, Not Peace But a Sword, covering the years from 1914 to 1960. And then chapter 25, Culture Wars, 1960 to the present. These weren't the strongest chapters in MacCulloch, to be completely honest, but there's a lot of good information there, and we'll try to sort it out and kind of recombine and perhaps reinterpret a little bit along the way. So, first section, a war that killed Christendom. Christendom here understood by MacCulloch as that union between Christianity and secular power. Page 916, all sides in World War I excitedly coupled Christian faith with national unity as they launched their armies. It's important to remember this conjunction and how totally it failed. If you haven't had an opportunity to see the film All Quiet on the Western Front yet, check it out. It is brutal in its honest and searing depiction of the consequences of war and just the ugliness and callous character of that war. As MacCulloch puts it on 917, the 4 years of slaughter revealed where the power lay between nationalism and religion. As we continue to study this conjunction, moving towards the book by Carter Haywood, The Seven Deadly Sins of White Christian Nationalism, it's good to remember this cathartic moment in the history of nations, for sure, but also in the history of Christianity, since Christianity was invoked by all parties. As MacCulloch puts it, by the end of the 1960s, so after the First World War, the Second World War, and then the protest movements that arose, the alliance between emperors and bishops, which Constantine had first generated, was a ghost. Now, that may be a little strong. I would certainly think there's reason to question it, given the resurgence of religious nationalism around the globe in the last decade or so. More about that shortly. But under this section, a war that killed Christendom, in addition to World War I, there's also the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and the establishment of the Soviet Union, of course, that followed. The Armenian genocide in Turkey as the Ottoman Empire declined, and a series then of population exchanges between Greece and Turkey, Armenia and Turkey, that really helped speed along the decline of Christianity throughout the Middle East, in Syria, Iraq, Egypt, Turkey, and so forth. You began to see this assumption that there had to be religious exclusivity to prop up a particular culture, and that assumption, as unwarranted and superstitious basically as it is, continues to undergird many regimes around the globe today related to religious nationalism. Second section of the chapter focuses on Great Britain, the last years of Christian empire, and it's a weak section, doesn't really describe the demise of the British Empire as Gandhi took it on. I'll just leave it at that. It would have been really helpful, I think, to have more attention to the challenges to the empire by this pacifist, albeit a nationalist pacifist, Gandhi, who studied Tolstoy's nonviolence and put it into practice in his own ways, overthrowing the British Empire without a weapon other than weapons of the spirit. Catholics and Christ the King, the Second Age of Catholic Missions, is the third section in the chapter, and it concentrates on Ireland, Poland, and the spread of Christianity and Roman Catholicism in particular into Africa, and then the rise of Franco in Spain, who clearly invoked Christ the King to sort of prop up this notion of a unified Spanish empire, uniformly Catholic. Again, an impossibility because people are so very different, and yet this idea continues to surface, this quest for a unified Christendom, even if it's in various nationalist particular modes. The history of the interwar years, MacCulloch writes on 935 to 36, documents democracy's steady subversion by authoritarian regimes. We've seen this before. We're seeing it now. As well, worth noting that fact as fascism arrives and the churches, by and large, went along. We see this very clearly in the churches in Nazism in the Second World War. Of course, the Pope signed a concordat with Hitler. The soon-to-be Pope, Pius the 12th, signed a concordat with Hitler in 1933. The denunciations of communism coming out of the Vatican were consistent. Needless to say, not the same kind of denunciations of the rise of the Nazis. There was mit brennender Sorge, with an anxious heart, and yet said nothing about the persecution of the Jews taking place in Germany. Protestants are as soiled as Catholics. MacCulloch concludes, especially the Lutherans. Adolf von Harnack, great church historian, Gottfried Kittel, ardent Nazis, part of the German Christian, the Deutschen Christian movement that completely capitulated to Nazi ideology, which wasn't actually Christian in any way, shape, or form, and yet used the churches to create solidarity and momentum in a really callous and cynical way. The Confessing Church, led by Karl Barth, yes, issued the Barmen Declaration, which is something at least, but is really actually a tepid critique focused on doctrine and dogma much more than on the persecution of the Jews. There's no mention of the Jews in the Barmen Declaration, in fact. So kind of across the board, massive system failures in many ways, the leading intellectual Christian theologians of the era in Germany. Couple examples of resistance. Andrei Steptitsky, the resistor in the Ukraine, and of course Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Again, a mixed record there in some ways, late to the game and actually was participated, took a role with the Nazis while also working to subvert it from the inside. But again, not nearly as clear advocacy for the Jewish people as we might have hoped. Stalin, during the same period, uses the Orthodox Church. In this sense, Vladimir Putin is very much in the Stalin mode in encouraging the practice of orthodoxy, as long as the practice of orthodoxy is consistent with his political aims and his own power. World Christianity Realigned, Ecumenical Beginnings. I was really disappointed with this section by MacCulloch. Again, it kind of wanders all over the place, starting in 1950 with the assertion by Pius XII of the doctrine of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, which is a weird place to start a section on the rise of ecumenism, which really goes back to the missionary movements. He does mention this, the missionary conference in Edinburgh in 1910, where missionaries got together and said, hey, it's stupid that we're competing with each other. We're on the same team. Let's cooperate. And that spirit of cooperation is really what marks the ecumenical movement from its inception down to today. And although MacCulloch does trace the emergence of these two separate streams, faith and order, focused on, ecclesiology and theology, and then life and work, focused on sort of work for justice and practical applications of Christianity in the field. He doesn't really give it the attention that it deserves, in my estimation. It's a startling development after 2,000 years to see the growth of this cooperation, mostly Protestant, but the Roman Catholics have been very active, and Vatican II then comes right afterwards in the 1960s, and some remarkable statements put together, and some remarkable examples of collaboration and cooperation on the ground too, in missionary work, which now is much less about converting and conquering and much more about accompaniment and practical service in the field. If you want to see what one of my predecessors at ULS, at the Philadelphia Seminary, Fred Nolde, put together, check out the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, just Google it, and he was responsible for the religious freedom clause within that rather startling document. All right, last section of chapter 24, World Christianity Realigned, Pentecostals and New Churches. Again, kind of all over the map, not really a coherent narrative line, but the emergence of Pentecostalism is, along with the emergence of ecumenism, the most significant story in the history of Christianity in the 20th century. It's grown rapidly. And MacCulloch is right when he says, yes, there's the prosperity gospel. Yes, there's a focus on, sort of me and Jesus and the presence of the Spirit. But at the same time, within Pentecostalism, there is this openness that you don't see in the fundamentalist movement and evangelicalism, even to a degree. There is this vitality and dynamism that has led Pentecostalism to grow very rapidly around the globe, especially in the global South, Latin America, and in Africa, in ways that are really fascinating and I think have great potential for the history of the church. We see it even at ULS in the relationships that we've developed with Kojic churches and with other churches where the fruits of the Spirit are evident and manifest, and yet there is this partnership between a Lutheran institution and these Pentecostally motivated and inspired congregations and denominations. And I think we can expect to continue to see that moving forward into the future. It's one of the exciting ways the world Christianity is realigning, yes, and there may be new configurations emerging in the future that can be quite exciting. So that's chapter 24. I've put more of a positive spin on both ecumenism and Pentecostalism than MacCulloch does, and he completely misses the rise of fundamentalism. He talks about the Scopes trial and so forth, but the significance of this innovation in the history of Christianity, we have to be very clear about this. He says it at one point in chapter 25 that the old-time religion isn't really that old, and that's exactly right. This attempt to style the five fundamentals as the core of Christian faith, it's nonsense. I mean, you go back to Nicaea, you can go back to, Athanasius, and that's the core of Christianity. Those are the fundamentals, have been, for Chalcedonian Christians at least, for a long time. And there's some disputes about those, as you're familiar if you studied with the first half of this course with me before. But fundamentalism is a modern movement disguising itself as if it were the historic tradition, when it's not. It's a severe truncation of the historic tradition, and especially in relationship to biblical interpretation. And it really is unfortunate that MacCulloch doesn't say more about that, and about the link then between that kind of fundamentalism and nationalism as well, which is what we see around the globe in many contexts today. All right, so the Second Vatican Council, again, kind of a tepid discussion, focused more on the backlash. Concludes by talking about how sexuality was not one of the things up for reform under Pope Pius or Pope Paul VI, after John the 23rd passed away. But I think MacCulloch underestimates the significance of Vatican II. Some of the changes that were instituted are irreversible. The rise of the vernacular liturgy, the increasing role of the laity in what is still a clerically dominated tradition, and in the ecumenical and interreligious initiatives undertaken. My last stop on my book tour in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland was in Zurich. And we got together in a Roman Catholic church in the fellowship hall for an iftar dinner with 250 people there. Muslims, Christians, and Jews gathered together to break the fast and then to learn about this Hizmet service movement. And the Roman Catholic priest, who was our host, has been doing this for 20 years. The Muslims say this is our church. And would that there would be more examples like this. And in fact, there are. Pretty much every city has these Vatican II inspired congregations that really took the ecumenical and interreligious initiatives and have run with them. MacCulloch, again, underestimates, I think, the revolutionary significance here. He calls the Second Vatican Council half a revolution. Well, no, the revolution succeeded in many ways in transforming Roman Catholicism, while there are, of course, still some areas, notably gender, sexuality, where there remains resistance. Catholics, Protestants, and Liberation, the second section, focuses on, again, helpfully, on the fight against poverty, but underestimates its significance and import. Catholic social teachings have been really clear about the economic dynamic at the heart of the gospel, that the gospel cannot be disentangled from how we live our lives and how we handle material resources. And MacCulloch cites, Gustavo Gutierrez's theology of liberation. Then it goes on to track, the influence of liberation theology in the civil rights movement, and in Korea and Minjung theology, and in decolonization in Africa. And that's pretty significant set of influences, all coming from this emphasis on recognizing the social and economic character of Christian teachings. And of course, it goes back even further to the social gospel movement. MacCulloch just kind of dismisses that in a few sentences. Unfortunately, I think it's really important to highlight that the social gospel movement in the late 19th, early 20th century, took on the trusts, the monopolies, and the first Gilded Age, and really offered a critique of that kind of greed from a Christian perspective and point of view, paving the way for liberation theology's idea of a preferential option for the poor, that God sides with the oppressed, as James Cone very clearly put it. And then you see this play itself out, perhaps most dramatically, in the critique and demise of apartheid in South Africa. Recognize apartheid was a Christian nationalist movement, Dutch Reformed Church, and got dismantled through the efforts of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, obviously Nelson Mandela from jail, and individuals like John Collins and the International Defense and Aid Fund, along with, MacCulloch doesn't mention this, but the Kairos theologians produced a Kairos document that was a clear critique of what they called state theology, the state theology of apartheid, and the systemic violence that followed from it, and then a critique of that from a Christian perspective and point of view, which sides with the people. Again, the Kairos document, put together by a consensus through a collaborative, deliberative process of Christian theologians, and that really marked a turning point in the struggle against apartheid that led to its fall. Still lots of troubles in South Africa, but a commitment to democracy and the dismantling of this Christian nationalist separatism. Tutu's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, of course, a remarkable example of Christian guided public policy focused on truth and reconciliation. I mean, it's really amazing how that developed and played itself out in apartheid, in healing some of the trauma that the nation and its people suffered by getting the true stories of the abuse and violence out, and then establishing practical measures to foster reconciliation, reparative justice rather than punitive justice. A remarkable example, again, of a Christian-informed public policy put into practice. A cultural revolution from the 60s, which MacCulloch kind of, again, dismisses as a manifestation of culture wars. I think that's a really shallow way to understand this time period from 1960 to the present. I think there's a lot more ferment going on. He's quite right that there are steep falls in numbers of people in pews, secularization, so-called, but secularization is limited to certain areas and regions. Christianity continues to grow around the globe, of course, as does Islam. He focuses too much on Britain. It's what he knows. It's what he's drawn to. And so he writes a lot about Anglicanism in Great Britain. But, the numbers for Sunday school attendance in Great Britain are pretty stunning. 1900, 55% of kids were enrolled. 1960, 24%. 1980, 9%. And by 2000, it was down to 4%. That is a pretty astonishing development. But I don't know about you, but anybody who's sat through some typical Sunday school classes might say, maybe not a terrible thing that's going away. Question is, what is developing to replace it? In terms of Christian education, that is transgenerational, cross-generational, and communicates the historic heart of the faith and its practices to young people. So MacCulloch says, there are some people who were celebrating the death of Christendom with the conviction that beyond it there lay better prospects for Christianity. I tend to be one of those people. MacCulloch thinks that's somewhat utopian. I think he doesn't have an accurate reading of the evidence. So the death of Christendom means the emergence of a Christianity focused not on state power or power over, but power with. And that collaborative and cooperative prospect for the future, it seems to me, is quite exciting. Old-time religion, affirmations. He does track the emergence of reaction to the liberation movements of the 1960s, the moral majority, and the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, the repudiation of Jimmy Carter's social-oriented Southern Baptist evangelicalism in favor of a clearly generated hostility to sexual freedom, an issue, generated by politicians by and large to mobilize and organize a base against abortion and against the freedom of women over their own bodies. It's really quite astonishing how this misogyny and homophobia also emerged during these years as a critique against the freedom of the movements, the liberation movements of the 1960s. While that was happening, of course, you have the sexual abuse scandal occurring within the Roman Catholic Church and the callous cover-up of it as well. It's really quite astonishing. And MacCulloch does a nice job tracking, the reign of John Paul II as the second longest pontificate ever, as an example of this old time religion. In some ways, again, in a new form, in a new guise. In the same way that fundamentalism was a modern movement, you see, JP2 also appealing to the tradition, but very selectively on these issues of abortion and contraception and so forth, in ways that, by and large, the Roman Catholic constituency in much of Europe, United States, and elsewhere just completely ignored. MacCulloch says it's the single most significant challenge to papal authority, that is the defiance of the Church's teachings on birth control since Martin Luther. That might be putting it a little bit strongly, but certainly in the skepticism that has emerged in relationship to ecclesiastical authority associated with the sexual abuse scandal, there's some evidence to suggest that people are being more critically engaged, and I happen to think that's a good thing long term. So the last section of the book, freedom, prospects, and fears. Yes, definitely prospects, although you don't see MacCulloch really talking about those very much. He kind of concludes near the end with some passages that suggest there might be hope for us all. Roman Catholic Church continues to grow around the globe. 52% of all Christians in the year 2000, which is astonishing. Orthodox 11, and Protestants make up the rest, 37% or so. Page 1006. Yes, you have just worked your way through a 1,000-page book. If you've stuck with this from the beginning to the end, religion is as likely to bring a sword as peace. I do not believe that statement is true anymore. It was true in the period of World War I. I think some lessons have been learned. And the vast majority of people on the ground, lay people especially, are committed to engaging as believers in ways that promote peace, not just for an individual and one's own, but between groups as well. MacCulloch does conclude with a nice quote about how music, page 1015, perhaps music might be one way past the impasse, which has been the experiences of some versions of the Protestant Reformation, tangled in the torrent of words which has flowed around the Word which dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. Let's stick with that as a way to conclude. Let's focus on music more than on sexuality, say. Let's focus on music and the beauty of this great gift of God, among the many gifts of God, amply evident in the stories of our ancestors and the faith over time. So that's The Armored MacCulloch, chapters 24 and 25. I look forward to your responses about the end of Christendom.